What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds each and every single day for the past 111 days, going up to 365. And in today's video, we're going to be going through why most ops problems aren't necessarily about the tools. We're going to be going through the problem, the breakdown, this, and how to solve it, and as well as the mechanisms to pull, and also finally the big takeaway from all of this. So why most ops problems aren't necessarily about the tools. While the problem necessarily comes down to that most founders blame the tools for inefficiency, but the reality is that the bottlenecks is usually on how people and processes interact. Basically, the interaction between people and the processes. That means the clarity that people are able to form within the systems and the processes that are being implemented in terms of your business as well. Understanding that is super key, and if people don't understand, or there's a breakdown in communication, then that ultimately leads down to inefficiency. And you solely can't rely because you solely can't rely on tools all the time, because at the end of the day you're dealing with humans, and humans interact and have a certain way of understanding complex tasks, and being able to break that down in a manner that is easily digestible for them is also important. So it's not necessarily just about the tools that are down to blame for inefficiency, but they rather act as a multiplier for what is there already. So taking tools, in that sense of what do, they ultimately amplify whatever system already exists. And at the end of the day, if you ask the question from first principles of what does the system necessarily come down to, it comes down to the interactions. And what are those interactions? They basically come as a result from humans, if you look at it from the foundation. That these interactions ultimately come from the point of view or the foundation of people being able to, build the systems, and also being able to interact. So you have the people building the systems, and then you have the people that are within the business. They're actively, implementing and also strategizing how to also use this, and understanding, what the future of this within the business also looks like. And then the breakdown from this is that we can look at it in three different layers. I like to take the layer approach because it ultimately allows us to peel back and look at the different layers and how they ultimately interact with each other. So the first layer that we have is ultimately the people. These are the roles, responsibilities, and incentives. So this is your sales team, this is your ops team, or even your sales and ops team, basically your sales ops team, and also your biz ops as well. This ultimately comes down to the roles, responsibilities that people have to say, hey, this is your specific role within the business, and this is the responsibility that you have, in the sense of, let's say it's operations, for example. You need to make sure that you're actively implementing these new workflows and tools that we ultimately have within the business. And then the incentives for that is ultimately saying, hey, we'll give you 5% commission for every time we scale or hit a certain threshold. And that ultimately incentivizes the people. And ultimately understanding that people come down as a result of these three different layers, which are the roles, responsibilities, and incentives. Then we're then able to understand that people need this interaction as well. It's not necessarily just about the tools, but it's also about these three layers, which all interact with each other, which ultimately means that we also need to look at the second layer, which ultimately comes down to the processes, because you have the people first, and then you have the processes which come after that, which needs to be implemented by the people, which are the repeated workflows and handoffs. So these workflows can come down to your sales, how you basically manage sales, how you manage outreach as well. So let's say you have your outreach system that ultimately works for your specific business. This ultimately needs to be able to be understood by the people, because if there's a breakdown between the people and the tools, which we'll get into just now, then ultimately you cannot scale your level of impact. And that's where ultimately understanding where the bottlenecks are within this specific step that we're going through ultimately is important, because it gives you an overview of how the different interactions play, whether it's the people, the processes, which are the repeatable workflows, and as well as the handoffs, which are also super important. Handoffs being, how are you then able to give this specific team member this task to complete, and how well are they able to understand it from a root perspective. So this ultimately comes down as to the level of clarity that they're then able to form within their mind, to say, they have this level of clarity in terms of what it is that they need to achieve, and are they achieving it well, also setting benchmarks as well in terms of how are we handling our handoff process. Because if you're just dumping this information overload on someone, that is ultimately not going to give you the result that you ultimately want for the specific business as well. And ultimately understanding that you have these repeated workflows, people need to be able to understand the processes. So it's people first, then the processes. Then that ultimately means that we're working this machine in layers and breaking it down in the sense that we're ultimately able to understand how these different key role players interact with each other. And that ultimately allows us to then look at the final stage, which is ultimately the tools that we use. I know I said processes, but at the bottom here it's supposed to be tools. So these are necessarily the tools that we ultimately are implementing. So this ultimately comes as a result of the people, process, and tools. So these can be your tools that you're integrating or just using as part of your tech stack as well. And this ultimately needs to be able to be communicated with these two other layers. So we can look at this tools. I'll just change it over here. We'll just have tools over there. Then you ultimately then able to understand how these are ultimately interacting with each other. And if we look at that, we can then say if people slash processes are misaligned, the tools can ultimately not fix that, because tools act as the amplifying layer for these two specific layers as well. So this happens when people understand their roles, responsibilities, and incentives. That is what motivates them basically, and also what they need to do in terms of understanding. And then we have the process, which are ultimately the repeatable workflows and the handoffs, like I said, and that ultimately is then amplified by the tools. So ultimately peeling back the layers and understanding that the tools will act as more so as an amplifying layer of these two prior steps is ultimately what we need to take into consideration as well, because they can be breakdown in many different places, and you can often put blame on the tools aspect of it, not realizing that there are people and processes that ultimately also have a role in this. Ultimately allows you to then ask from first principles, to ask the question of where is this process breaking down? Is it the people? Are people lacking clarity in terms of their roles? Are they lacking clarity in terms of the incentives? Because people, if they're not incentivized, they're ultimately not going to be able to push as much as they possibly can. And is it part of the processes layer? So saying, hey, are we focusing on our repeatable workflows, and are we making sure that these repeatable workflows are as efficient as they possibly can be? And if not, how can we better it? As well as our handoff process, how can we ultimately use these two layers to ultimately power the tools that we're actively using? Because ultimately understanding this unlocks a level of awareness that ultimately scales, and also makes sure that you're understanding that most ops problems aren't necessarily about the tools, but they also come down as a result of these other interactions that ultimately play a role as well. And then ultimately we can then move on to how to basically think about solving this. This ultimately comes down to the video I made 2 days ago or yesterday, which was ultimately mapping out the true workflow, what steps actually need to happen, basically being able to identify the friction points as well. Are they delays? Are they double handling? Or are they errors that are ultimately happening within this specific workflow? And then we can choose the tools that ultimately support and automate and not replace thinking, which should be in bold, because I think this is one of the most important aspects that in the rise that with nowadays that there's this AI boom that's happening. Cognitive offloading is a real thing. We need to make sure, and I like to integrate this, that we need to make sure that within our structure we are not falling into cognitive offloading, whereby we're just handing each and every single task to AI. That we need to make sure that we're no matter what we're doing, we're ultimately not replacing thinking, because our thinking thinking and the way that we're then able to solve problems is our own unique abilities. And then, having to leave this off to cognitive offloading, giving AI each and every single prompt and each and every single thing that we need to think about is ultimately not gonna, fuel the process, human aspect of it. And that ultimately comes down to how can we then map out the true workflow, basically understanding what are the steps that actively need to happen, and then deleting the steps that don't need to happen. And if you look at first principles, adding 10% back, and then just having a ratio of how much percent are you actively adding back. And if you're not adding back, then ultimately you need to make sure that you're deleting a lot more or you're deleting a lot less. But then also identifying the friction points, like I mentioned, are the delays, double bookings, and errors that are actively happening within the specific workflow, and then asking the questions and digging a lot deeper in terms of the layers, asking why 5 times to ultimately peel back the layers and fully understand where the bottlenecks are that ultimately lead to the ops challenges that businesses are actively facing. And then also the mechanisms to pull. So what are the mechanisms that you can ultimately pull as a business owner? And these are the ones that I actively think about each and every single day, which are shadow your team, which you need to be able to see the bottlenecks in action, basically see the team's processes, how they're actively implementing, whether it's SOPs, workflows, how are they actively doing that. Literally just get them to record their screen and watch like 30 minutes to an hour of them literally just doing their work. Ultimately that is going to give you an insight into where the bottlenecks actively are lying. Is it the people aspect of it? Are people actively understanding what it is that they need to do on a day-to-day basis? And if not, you'll then be able to see that, and through that you also then able to document the process before tech, basically saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're documenting how we want to get it done, and then we integrate the technology aspect of it, not integrate the technology aspect of it and then document it, because you can do both. But the most efficient way that I've seen it in my personal experience is ultimately being documenting the process first, and then building the tech around that. But that ultimately means that you need to be able to test one automation at a time. Don't just tool bomb stack, which stack bomb, which ultimately means that you just stacking a bunch of different tools and you're hoping that they will work. I think strategic deployment of tools is one of the most important modes, and I spoke about this in a previous video where I was saying, hey, we are taking this approach in terms of mapping out what are the actual systems that are actively needed within the business in order to create leverage and competitive advantage for them. And that ultimately comes as a result of understanding what are the mechanisms that we need to be able to pull, and you as a business owner as well, what are the things that your team are lacking in terms of clarity, and also how can we then combat that as well. I think asking why, like I always say, 5 times ultimately allows you to dig a lot deeper, and through digging a lot deeper then you're able to understand in layers of saying, hey, is it the context layer? Is it the process layer? What layer is ultimately failing, and how can we then solve for that? Because if you don't ask those questions, then you're ultimately going to be scratching your head when things go wrong, and blaming the tools in this instance and saying, hey, our tool's not working, when you could have asked the question of, hey, what is behind our tools not working? What are the processes in between that, from the tools working and being deployed before that? What is the step before that? And then peeling the layers back a lot further ultimately helps you understand that this is a human aspect as well. And through this we ultimately need to understand from a first principles perspective, because that ultimately allows us to reason up from there. And that ultimately means that the big takeaway that I want you guys to have from this is ultimately my belief that tools don't solve the problems. System design solves the problem. Where the leverage ultimately lies is how you design the systems, how you then able to build from the ground up, the systems and the workflows that you ultimately need. They're super specific to your specific business needs. That is where the moat and the leverage lies. That is where you're ultimately able to create this competitive advantage for yourself. And that ultimately means that with this knowledge that you have, then the tools only act as an amplifying layer for clarity or the chaos that you ultimately have. So ultimately, if you have chaos in terms of the previous steps, in terms of thinking, and also the way that you're documenting and designing the systems, then ultimately that is only gonna amplify the tools are ultimately gonna amplify the chaos that is within. So how can we then understand it in terms of system design? How are we actively building out the system so that we're not just stacking tools, but we understand where the bottlenecks fully lie? This is the process that I'm actively thinking about in different layers, in terms of why most ops problems, and my personal belief that why most ops problems don't necessarily come as a result of the tools, but the processes behind those tools. And that is where all the magic happens and all the leverage is ultimately created. And if you guys like this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram. Check out my newsletter. I've recently just started that out, and I will be posting my first newsletter on Sunday the 21st. So make sure to check out that newsletter. It's going to be super deep, super tactical. I'm going to be posting each and every Sunday, so I'm super excited for that. So like I said, if you guys want to check me out, check out the newsletter, also the socials, X, LinkedIn, Instagrams. They're all in the description, and I will see you guys in the next video.